Hi guys, I'm LoulouVZ, and today we are going to do a little tutorial about anatomy, focusing on simplified styles such as cartoon and anime. Anatomy science in memorial times has been a challenge when it comes to drawing, even for me, who has been drawing for several years. But I have some tips that I hope can help you to understand it a little better. What is always recommended is to start from the basis, which is study realistic human anatomy. At first sight, this seems to be very complicated and it can scare us a little, but don't despair, we will go by parts. First we will draw what will be our skeleton. And with this, I mean a stick man, not a realistic skeleton. This will help us to define our pose. The next exercise will be to separate this body into the most important parts. First we have the head, neck, shoulders, elbow, arms and hands. Then we will continue with the torso. Personally, I like to divide it into upper and lower torso, having as a dividing line the navel. We continue with the thighs, knees, legs, and feet. These pieces will be the key for the anatomy of our drawings, as they will help us to define how to pose them, their volumetry and proportions. Now comes the exercise of drawing over the muscles in more detail. This will be to analyze how they work. It is not necessary to draw absolutely all the muscles, only the main shapes. We will do the head with the classic cross to guide us to where the character is looking. Then in the neck, we can appreciate these joints that ends in the center of the clavicles. Then the clavicles join with the shoulders to continue with the arms. Something interesting is that the parts of the armpit joins with the pectorals. Note well how the muscles join. These unions will help us to get an idea of where the shadows of the body could be, replacing the lines for lights and shadows. Now we go through the six-pack. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. At the end of the six-pack, the navel begins. Then follows a line that reaches the pelvis. We continue along the leg, the knees, marking it a little. In this part, instead of making the legs like this, draw this part of the buttock. This helps us to give a better volumetry of the leg. We continue with the thighs, knees, calf, and our feet. We separate the most key parts. Remember that the inner muscles will be a guide for the shadows, but be careful, don't try to put shadows everywhere, because sometimes the shadows will only cause more noise instead of helping the final result. Don't forget to look at reference to get a better notion of the human body. Remember that this neck muscle has a triangular shape. Now comes another exercise, which is the stylization of the body. What do I mean by stylization? By this, I mean a simplification through an artistic pursuit. In my case, I like to stylize with more angular figures. We are going to consider the basic shape of this body, but exaggerating some parts a bit, giving emphasis to the parts that interest us, and the style we seek to reflect. In the case of the torso, I like it a little more toonish. So at the time of drawing, one is free to add or omit parts, as long as it has an aesthetic purpose. This muscle here make it smaller, and the gluteus I will make it a little bigger. We continue with the legs. Remember to keep the same thickness in each leg, because sometimes the leg can be bigger than the other. Here I decide to saturate the calf and make it more angular. Then we continue with the feet. Here to stylize it, I will use something similar to those games we used to do when we were kids of joining points, which will be to look for the key points of our figure, and then draw the lines. For the hands, the same. I take the key shapes and simplify. Here we can see the difference between the literally tracing human model and the stylized one. This last one, we can exaggerate it even more if we wish. Now comes what will be our last phase, the final pose. Here we will try to replicate in our own style of drawing and proportions the same pose and musculature. Pay attention to the key parts. With this, you can exaggerate the proportions, always following the idea of the base anatomy. The result is a simplified character, but with an anatomy more faithful to the real thing. To go deeper into the study of anatomy, musculature, and bones, I recommend you to read this book, Morpho, Anatomy for Artist, Michael Laurizel, and What is Stylization More Oriented to Anime? How to Draw Manga, Volume 4, Bodies and Anatomy. Now we move to the other subject, which is posing. We can learn to draw human bodies, but what happens when it's time to pose them? This part can be a bit difficult if we don't know where to start. Here I'm going to make an example with Spaicy and a pose in which I would like to draw her. For this, I searched the internet for pose references. What we are going to do is to replicate this pose in this character. But we are not going to use the same proportions of this girl in Spaicy, since they are different. For this is advisable to first analyze what her proportions are. Spaicy has a total of 6 heads, while the girl next to her has 8. The torso of the girl is much longer than Spaicy's, so we must adapt to try to replicate this pose with the proportions of our character. To start working on this, I recommend making the key parts of both bodies, just as we did with the anatomy study. When we are doing it with the reference pose, pay attention to the direction of the parts, where the shoulders, hips, and the rest of the body points. Here we can notice that this pose has an S shape. This can be exaggerated when drawing a character. Now we will try to replicate this pose, respecting the directions of the body parts of the reference, adapting to Spaicy's proportions. For more interesting results, exaggerate the pose a little bit. And finally, the hair, which is an important part of the silhouette of our character. And speaking of silhouettes, this is a very important part when designing and posing characters. A good character design and pose is characterized by being distinguishable only with its silhouette. Let's use as an example this 3D model. Here we can see that its silhouette is understood without problems. However, exaggerating even more the pose can help us to make it much more recognizable, iconic, and dynamic. The opposite example will be to show the same pose in an angle where the silhouette is not well distinguished. We must be careful with that and look for the most favorable angle. Now, when we try to replicate this pose with our character, keep in mind these factors. That is, silhouette is recognizable and dynamic, and avoid conflict with the tangents, as these generate noise in the pose. Always keep a good distance. Finally, analyzing Spaicy's pose a bit, we can see that her feet are well placed on the ground, with a dynamic distances, reflecting a more extroverted character. A different approach will be to make her pose more close, which makes her look stiffer and less expressive. This happens a lot when we are just starting to draw. But don't be afraid, look for dynamic pose references and give it a try. Conclusion. As with many things, drawings requires a great deal of observing and practicing. Observe, analyze, and study the human body, simplify it, and bring it to your style. Don't forget that if you use Clip Studio Paint, you can use the 3D models as references for your drawings, along with the countless poses to use and download in the Assets section of the application. That's all, folks. I wish you a lot of lucky practicing anatomy and poses. See you in the next video. Bye bye!